Have you ever wondered how one moment of kindness can completely change the trajectory of your life? Sometimes the smallest gesture creates ripples that reach farther than we could ever imagine, touching hearts and changing destinies in ways that seem almost like fate. Let me know in the comments what state you're from, and if you believe in the power of unexpected kindness to transform everything. Sophia Delacroix clutched her worn purse tighter as she hurried down the busy Manhattan sidewalk, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. At 22, she had grown accustomed to running everywhere, always racing against time, always one step behind where she needed to be. The double shift at the Grandview Hotel had ended only 30 minutes ago, and her second job at the diner started in 20 minutes across town. The math never worked in her favor, but she had learned to make impossible schedules somehow function through sheer determination and caffeine. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father asking if she could pick up his heart medication on her way home tonight. Sophia's chest tightened as she calculated the cost in her head. $47 for pills that would last 2 weeks. She had $63 in her checking account, and rent was due in 5 days. The familiar weight of financial stress settled across her shoulders like a heavy blanket, the kind that made breathing just a little harder with each passing hour. That's when she saw the elderly woman. The woman stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the wind, wearing an elegant navy coat that spoke of quality and care. She held several shopping bags that looked too heavy for her small frame, and her face showed the kind of distress that Sophia recognized immediately. The woman was patting her purse with increasing panic, her brown eyes wide with worry as a yellow taxi idled at the curb, its driver drumming impatient fingers on the steering wheel. Sophia slowed her pace, her heart responding to the woman's obvious distress before her mind could calculate whether she had time to help. She had been raised by a father who, despite his struggles with gambling, had taught her that kindness was never a luxury they couldn't afford. Thomas Delacroix might have made mistakes that cost them dearly, but he had instilled in his daughter a moral compass that pointed toward helping others even when she could barely help herself. I'm going to be late again, Sophia thought, but her feet were already changing direction, carrying her toward the woman who looked close to tears. Excuse me, Sophia said softly, approaching with the gentle manner she had perfected during her years working in hospitality. Is everything all right? The elderly woman looked up with eyes that held both surprise and relief. Oh, dear, she said, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent that made her words sound musical despite her distress. I seem to have miscalculated. I thought I had enough cash for the taxi, but I'm short $12. I don't want to make this poor driver wait while I find an ATM, and my son isn't answering his phone. Sophia glanced at the taxi meter, then at the woman's face, seeing the kind of pride that made asking for help painful. She knew that feeling intimately. Her own reflection showed the same stubborn independence that refused to accept charity, the same determination to handle problems alone that often made situations worse instead of better. Without hesitation, Sophia reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, one of the 3 20s that represented her entire cash reserve until Friday's paycheck. Here, she said, pressing the money into the woman's surprised hand. This should cover it with a little extra for the driver. The woman's eyes widened, her manicured fingers closing around the bill as if it were precious. Oh, I couldn't possibly. You don't even know me, and this is too generous. Sophia smiled, the kind of genuine warmth that had made her popular with hotel guests despite her lowly position on the housekeeping staff. It's just money, she said, though they both knew it was much more than that. You clearly need to get somewhere, and sometimes we all need a little help. The taxi driver, who had been watching the exchange with growing impatience, seemed to soften at Sophia's gesture. He got out and helped the elderly woman with her bags, his previous irritation replaced by something approaching respect for the young woman who had solved his problem with such grace. As the woman settled into the back seat, she rolled down the window and reached for Sophia's hand. What's your name, dear? I'm Maria Torino, and I won't forget this kindness. Sophia Delacroix, Sophia replied, giving the woman's hand a gentle squeeze. And please don't worry about paying me back. I hope you have a safe trip home. Maria's eyes studied Sophia's face with an intensity that felt almost maternal, as if she were memorizing every detail. You have a beautiful heart, Sophia. Thank you for reminding me that there are still good people in this world. The taxi pulled away, leaving Sophia standing on the sidewalk with $43 instead of 63, 20 minutes to get across town, and a strange feeling in her chest that had nothing to do with financial anxiety. For just a moment, she had felt like the person her father had raised her to be rather than the desperate young woman trying to keep her head above water that she had become. She arrived at the diner 17 minutes late, earning a sharp look from her manager and a verbal warning about punctuality that she accepted with the same grace she brought to everything else. As she tied her apron and began taking orders, Sophia found her mind drifting back to Maria Torino's grateful smile and the way the woman had said her name like it mattered. What Sophia didn't know was that across town, in a penthouse office overlooking Central Park, Maria Torino was recounting the story of her rescue to her son with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for miraculous events. Lorenzo Torino sat behind his mahogany desk, his dark eyes focused on quarterly reports that detailed the legitimate side of his business empire. At 34, he had built a reputation as a shrewd businessman in import-export, though those closest to him knew that his true power came from his position as head of one of New York's most influential crime families. He commanded respect through a combination of strategic intelligence and the kind of decisive action that left no room for doubt about consequences. But when his mother called to tell him about the young woman who had given her last $20 to help a stranger, Lorenzo found his attention shifting completely away from profit margins and territorial disputes. She didn't hesitate, Maria said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk with her shopping bags arranged carefully beside her. This girl, this Sophia, she saw I needed help and just acted. No questions, no conditions. When was the last time you encountered that kind of genuine kindness? Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, studying his mother's animated expression. In his world, kindness usually came with strings attached. Favors were currency, and nothing was given without the expectation of something in return. The idea of someone helping his mother without knowing who she was, without wanting anything back, struck him as either impossibly naive or remarkably pure. Did you get her last name? He asked, already reaching for his phone. Delacroix. Sophia Delacroix. She said it like it was French, and she had this way of speaking, Lorenzo. Very gentle, but strong. And her eyes. She had the most honest eyes I've seen in years. Lorenzo typed a quick message to his head of security, requesting a background check on Sophia Delacroix, age approximately early 20s, working in Manhattan. It was a standard precaution, the kind of information gathering that had kept his family safe for 3 generations. But as he sent the message, Lorenzo found himself curious about this young woman for reasons that had nothing to do with security. 2 hours later, his phone buzzed with a comprehensive report that painted a picture of struggle and integrity that impressed him despite his usual cynicism. Sophia Marie Delacroix, age 22, employed by Grandview Hotel Housekeeping Department and Murphy's Diner. Father Thomas Delacroix, disabled construction worker with significant medical debt and a history of gambling addiction. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no associations with law enforcement or rival families. What captured Lorenzo's attention most was a note from his security chief. Subject works 70-plus hours per week, sends majority of income to medical bills and father's care. Recent credit check shows extreme financial stress, but no defaulted payments. Employer reviews consistently mention reliability and kindness to guests. Lorenzo stared at the report for several minutes, trying to reconcile the numbers with the story his mother had told. Sophia Delacroix was barely surviving financially, yet she had given away money she clearly couldn't spare to help a stranger. In Lorenzo's experience, desperation made people selfish, not generous. This young woman represented something he had begun to believe didn't exist anymore. He made another call, this one to the security company that monitored the Grandview Hotel. 20 minutes later, he was watching grainy footage of Sophia helping his mother on the sidewalk, seeing the exact moment when she made the decision to help without any visible internal debate. The camera caught her expression clearly, and Lorenzo found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clear blue eyes that seemed to reflect genuine warmth even through the security footage. But what struck him most was the complete absence of calculation in her actions. She saw a problem, assessed her ability to solve it, and acted. No hesitation, no visible concern for her own circumstances. Lorenzo had built his power on understanding people's motivations, reading their desires and fears to predict their actions. But watching Sophia Delacroix's spontaneous kindness, he felt off balance in a way that was both uncomfortable and intriguing. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. When was the last time you encountered that kind of genuine kindness? The answer was simple and troubling. Never. In 34 years of life, most of it spent in a world where loyalty was bought and trust was earned through fear, Lorenzo realized he had never witnessed the kind of unselfish generosity his mother described. But Sophia Delacroix had given it freely to a stranger, and now Lorenzo found himself wondering what kind of person chose kindness when kindness was a luxury they couldn't afford. 3 days after her encounter with Maria Torino, Sophia was wheeling a housekeeping cart through the Grandview Hotel's marble lobby when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She turned to see the elegant elderly woman approaching with a warm smile, looking even more distinguished than Sophia remembered in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sophia's monthly rent. "Sophia, dear, what a wonderful coincidence," Maria said, her eyes twinkling with what Sophia would later realize was carefully orchestrated delight. "I was hoping I might run into you again." Sophia smiled, genuinely pleased to see the woman she had helped, though she felt suddenly self-conscious about her hotel uniform and the cleaning supplies visible on her cart. "Mrs. Torino, how lovely to see you. I hope you're well. Please, call me Maria. And I'm more than well, thanks to your kindness the other day." Maria's gaze shifted slightly, and Sophia noticed a man approaching from across the lobby. "I'd like you to meet my son, Lorenzo," she called, her voice carrying that particular maternal tone that brooked no argument. Sophia turned to look at the man walking toward them and felt her breath catch in her throat. Lorenzo Torino was tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively move aside as he crossed the room. His dark hair was styled perfectly, and he wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been crafted specifically for his broad shoulders and lean frame. But it was his eyes that held her attention, deep green with flecks of gray that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. When he smiled at his mother, his entire face transformed from intimidating to devastatingly handsome, and Sophia felt a flutter of attraction so immediate and powerful that it left her slightly dizzy. "Lorenzo," Maria said as he reached them, "this is Sophia Delacroix, the angel I told you about." "Sophia, my son Lorenzo. He's in the import business." Lorenzo extended his hand to Sophia, and when their fingers touched, she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with static electricity. His hand was warm and strong, with calluses that suggested he did more than sit behind a desk, and he held her gaze with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the crowded lobby. "Miss Delacroix," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that made her name sound intimate despite the formal address. "My mother hasn't stopped talking about your kindness. She's convinced you're some kind of saint." Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, both from embarrassment and from the way his eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her face. She was acutely aware that she looked nothing like the polished women who probably populated his world, with her hair escaping its ponytail and her uniform wrinkled from hours of work. "I'm hardly a saint," Sophia replied, trying to keep her voice steady while her heart performed gymnastics in her chest. "I just did what anyone would do." Lorenzo's smile deepened, and Sophia noticed that it didn't quite reach his eyes, as if he was used to measuring his expressions carefully. "I think you'd be surprised how few people would actually do what you did," he said. "Most people in this city walk past problems that aren't their own." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with human selfishness, a cynicism that made Sophia's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. She found herself wondering what kind of life would make someone so young sound so certain about people's capacity for indifference. Maria glanced between them with the kind of satisfaction that made Sophia suspect this meeting was less coincidental than it appeared. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice carrying a hint of suggestion, "perhaps you could give Sophia a ride home. I imagine she's had a long day, and it's getting quite cold outside." Sophia opened her mouth to politely decline, but Lorenzo was already nodding. Of course, he said, his attention focused entirely on Sophia in a way that made her feel simultaneously flattered and unnerved. I'd be happy to save you from the subway crowd. I couldn't impose, Sophia began, but Maria was already waving away her protests with the kind of maternal authority that Sophia recognized from her own upbringing. Nonsense, Maria said firmly. Lorenzo has nothing but time, and I insist. After what you did for me, it's the least we can do. Sophia looked between mother and son, noting the way Lorenzo watched her with patient attention, as if her answer actually mattered to him. The smart thing would be to decline, to maintain the professional distance that kept her safe from complications she couldn't afford. But standing there in the hotel lobby with Lorenzo Torino's green-gray eyes focused on her like she was the most important person in his world, Sophia found her usual caution deserting her. If you're sure it's not too much trouble, she heard herself saying, though she immediately wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. 20 minutes later, Sophia found herself settling into the passenger seat of a black Mercedes that probably cost more than she would make in 5 years. The interior was cream leather and polished wood, and it smelled like expensive cologne and new car luxury. She tried not to touch anything, hyper-aware of her place in a world that clearly operated by different rules than her own. Lorenzo slid into the driver's seat with fluid grace, and Sophia noticed that he moved like someone who was completely comfortable in his own skin, confident in a way that seemed effortless rather than performed. He adjusted the mirror and turned to her with a smile that made her stomach flutter. "Where am I taking you?" he asked, starting the engine with a soft purr that spoke of German engineering and serious horsepower. Sophia gave him her address, a modest building in Queens that would probably look like a tenement compared to wherever he lived. She watched his hands on the steering wheel, noting that they were larger than they had appeared when he shook her hand, with long fingers that suggested both strength and precision. As they drove through Manhattan traffic, Lorenzo asked questions that seemed designed to learn about her without making her feel interrogated. He discovered that she worked 2 jobs, that her father was disabled, that she was saving money for nursing school when her current obligations allowed. Sophia found herself sharing more than she intended, drawn by his apparent genuine interest and the way he listened like her answers actually mattered. What she didn't know was that Lorenzo was comparing everything she said to the background report he had read, finding her honesty refreshing in a way that surprised him. In his world, everyone had angles, everyone wanted something. But Sophia Delacroix seemed to want nothing more than the chance to work hard and take care of the people she loved. "Your father is lucky to have such a devoted daughter," Lorenzo said as they stopped at a red light. Not everyone would sacrifice their own opportunities for family. Sophia felt a familiar pang of guilt mixed with fierce love. "He's all I have left," she said simply. "After my mother died when I was 16, he tried his best to raise me alone. He made mistakes, but he never stopped trying to do better." Lorenzo heard the forgiveness in her voice, the way she spoke about her father's gambling addiction as if it were an illness rather than a moral failing. In his experience, people were quick to judge and slow to forgive, especially when someone's weakness had cost them personally. But Sophia seemed to possess a capacity for unconditional love that he found both admirable and slightly bewildering. He made a mental note to have his people look into Thomas Delacroix's current debts more thoroughly. If Sophia was struggling to pay for her father's medical care, there might be ways Lorenzo could help without making it obvious that the assistance came from him. The thought surprised him with its intensity. He barely knew this woman, yet the idea of her working herself into exhaustion to pay bills that could be solved with a phone call made something protective stir in his chest. As they approached Sophia's building, Maria's voice echoed in his mind. "You should invite her to dinner this weekend. She needs good food and company, and you need to remember what genuine people look like." "Sophia," Lorenzo said as he pulled to a stop in front of her building, "my mother is having a family dinner this Sunday. She specifically asked me to invite you, and I think she might never forgive me if you don't come." Sophia turned to look at him, her blue eyes wide with surprise. "That's very kind, but I couldn't intrude on family time." "You wouldn't be intruding," Lorenzo said, and realized he meant it more than he had expected. "My mother doesn't extend invitations lightly. She genuinely likes you, and so do I." The last words slipped out with more honesty than he had intended, and Sophia felt her cheeks warm under his direct gaze. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her feel like he saw past her circumstances to something worth knowing. I don't want to be any trouble, Sophia said, though part of her was already imagining what it would be like to see Lorenzo again, to spend time in his family's world. Trust me, Lorenzo replied, his voice carrying a hint of humor. You're the opposite of trouble. You're probably the best thing that's happened to my mother in months. Sophia found herself smiling despite her reservations. In that case, she said, I'd be honored to join your family for dinner. As she walked toward her building, Sophia felt Lorenzo's eyes on her back, a warmth that followed her all the way to her apartment door. She didn't notice the black sedan that pulled up after Lorenzo drove away, or the way Lorenzo's security team began their discreet surveillance to ensure her safety. Inside her apartment, Sophia's roommate Cassie looked up from her textbooks with raised eyebrows. Was that a Mercedes? She asked, moving to the window to peer down at the street. Sophia kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto their secondhand couch. A friend gave me a ride home, she said, trying to sound casual. Cassie turned from the window with the kind of expression that suggested she wasn't buying Sophia's nonchalant tone. A friend with a car that costs more than we'll make in the next decade? Sophia, please tell me you're not getting involved with some rich guy who thinks you're a charity case. The words stung because they echoed Sophia's own fears. She had learned to be wary of wealthy men who saw her circumstances as an opportunity for exploitation disguised as generosity. But Lorenzo hadn't felt predatory. He had felt genuinely interested in her as a person, not as a project. It's not like that, Sophia said, though she wasn't entirely sure what it was like. He's just being kind. Cassie sat down beside her with the expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome truth. Honey, men like that don't give rides home to housekeepers out of kindness. They do it because they want something. Just promise me you'll be careful. Sophia nodded, appreciating her friend's concern even as she felt defensive about Lorenzo's motives. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and remembering the way Lorenzo's hand had felt against hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sunday dinner might change everything. What she didn't know was that Lorenzo was lying in his own bed across the city, thinking about her honest blue eyes and wondering when he had started looking forward to something as simple as sharing a meal with someone who didn't know enough about his world to be afraid of him. Sunday evening found Sophia standing at the ornate iron gates of the Torino estate in Westchester, clutching a bottle of wine that had cost her an hour's wages and feeling increasingly out of place with each passing second. The house beyond the gates looked like something from a magazine about how billionaires lived, all stone facade, and perfectly manicured grounds that seemed to stretch for acres in every direction. She had changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple navy dress that was her nicest piece of clothing, though she suspected it would look shabby compared to whatever Lorenzo's family considered appropriate dinner attire. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the intercom button, and she wondered if it was too late to claim a sudden illness and escape back to Queens where she belonged. The gates swung open silently, and Sophia walked up a curved driveway that was longer than her entire street. Security cameras tracked her movement from multiple angles, though she tried not to think about how many people were probably watching her approach. 2 men in dark suits stood near the front entrance, and while they nodded politely as she passed, Sophia noticed the way their jackets hung slightly loose on one side, suggesting concealed weapons that made her stomach tighten with unease. This isn't normal, she thought as she climbed marble steps toward massive wooden doors that looked like they had been imported from some European castle. Rich people don't usually need armed guards for family dinners. Before she could ring the doorbell, the front door swung open to reveal Maria Torino wearing an elegant burgundy dress and a smile that immediately eased some of Sophia's tension. The older woman looked genuinely delighted to see her, as if Sophia's presence was the best possible outcome of her weekend. Sophia, my dear, you look absolutely lovely, Maria said, embracing her warmly before stepping back to admire her dress. Navy is perfect on you. Lorenzo will be speechless. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks at the suggestion, though she couldn't deny that she had chosen the dress partly because it brought out her eyes and fitted her figure in a way that made her feel confident despite her surroundings. She handed Maria the wine bottle with an apologetic smile. I wasn't sure what to bring, Sophia said. I hope this is appropriate. Maria accepted the bottle with the kind of graciousness that made expensive wine and corner store selections seem equally valued. This is perfect and very thoughtful. Lorenzo is in the garden if you'd like to join him while I finish preparations. He's been pacing like a caged animal since this morning. Sophia followed Maria through rooms that looked like museum exhibits, all antique furniture and oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. But despite the obvious wealth, there was warmth in the personal touches, family photographs, and worn leather books that suggested this was a home rather than just a showcase. The garden was spectacular, even in October when most of the flowers had finished blooming for the season. Stone pathways wound between carefully maintained beds and sculptured hedges, leading to a fountain that sparkled in the early evening light. Sophia found Lorenzo standing beside a rose garden, his hands in the pockets of perfectly tailored dark pants, looking out over the grounds with an expression that seemed almost melancholy. He had traded his business suit for casual clothes that somehow made him even more attractive, a cream sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders, and the kind of relaxed confidence that came from being completely comfortable in his own space. When he heard her footsteps on the stone path, he turned with a smile that transformed his entire face from brooding to genuinely pleased. "You came," he said, and Sophia heard something like relief in his voice, as if he hadn't been entirely certain she would follow through on her promise. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Sophia asked, moving closer and trying not to notice how the garden setting made him look like something from a romantic movie. All dark hair and striking features framed by carefully tended beauty. Lorenzo considered her question with the kind of honesty that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "In my experience, people often find reasons to avoid situations that make them uncomfortable," he said. "And I imagine this," he gestured toward the house and grounds, "might be overwhelming for someone not used to it." Sophia appreciated his directness even as it confirmed her own insecurities. "It is overwhelming," she admitted. "I keep expecting someone to tell me I'm in the wrong place and escort me to the servant's entrance." Lorenzo's expression darkened slightly, and Sophia caught a glimpse of something dangerous in his green-gray eyes before it disappeared behind his careful control. "You're not a servant here," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that suggested he was used to his words being final. "You're our guest, and more than that, you're someone my mother cares about. That makes you family, at least in her mind." The word family sent a warm flutter through Sophia's chest, though she tried not to read too much into his phrasing. She had learned to be cautious about belonging anywhere, having spent most of her adult life on the outside of other people's security. "Your garden is beautiful," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Do you spend much time out here?" Lorenzo began walking along one of the paths, and Sophia fell into step beside him, aware of how much taller he was and the way his presence seemed to command the space around them. "I come out here when I need to think," he said. "My father planted most of these roses when I was young. He said a man needed something beautiful to look at when the world got too ugly." There was something in his tone that suggested familiarity with ugliness, a weariness that seemed too deep for someone only in his 30s. Sophia found herself studying his profile, noting the slight tension in his jaw that suggested carefully controlled emotion. "What happened to your father?" she asked gently, recognizing the past tense and the way his shoulders had stiffened slightly. Lorenzo was quiet for several moments, and Sophia began to think he wouldn't answer when he finally spoke. "He died when I was 25, he said. "Heart attack, officially. But really, I think the stress of his responsibilities killed him. He carried too much weight for too many years." Sophia heard the guilt in his voice, the suggestion that Lorenzo had inherited whatever burden had cost his father his life. She wanted to ask more questions, to understand what kind of stress could kill a man in his 50s, but something in Lorenzo's expression warned her away from pushing too hard. "I'm sorry," she said instead. "It must have been difficult to lose him so young." Lorenzo stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his gaze intense enough to make her breath catch. "It was," he said, "but it also taught me that time is precious, especially time with people who matter." The way he looked at her when he said it made Sophia's heart perform that same gymnastics routine it had managed in the hotel lobby, a combination of attraction and nervousness that left her slightly dizzy. There was something in his expression that suggested she might be someone who mattered, though the logical part of her mind insisted that was impossible after such a short acquaintance. Before she could respond, a voice called from the house, breaking the intimate moment like a stone thrown through glass. "Lorenzo, stop monopolizing our guest, and bring her inside before the antipasto gets warm." A young woman appeared on the terrace, waving at them with the kind of energetic enthusiasm that made Sophia smile immediately. She was clearly Lorenzo's sister, with the same dark hair and striking features, though her beauty was softer, more approachable than her brother's intense magnetism. "My sister Gianna," Lorenzo explained, his tone carrying the affectionate exasperation of an older brother. "She has no concept of timing or subtlety." As they walked toward the house, Sophia felt the weight of Lorenzo's attention like a physical thing, warm and focused entirely on her. She was hyper-aware of the space between them, the way his hand occasionally brushed hers as they navigated the garden path, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with the autumn air. Dinner was served in a dining room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, with a table that could have seated 12 but felt intimate with just the four of them. Gianna proved to be charming and direct, asking Sophia questions about her work and family with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Sophia found herself relaxing despite the formal setting, drawn by the obvious affection between the family members and the way they included her in their conversation as if she belonged there. Maria told embarrassing stories about Lorenzo's childhood, making him roll his eyes while Sophia laughed, and Gianna shared her plans for graduate school in art history with the kind of passion that reminded Sophia of her own abandoned dreams of nursing school. But as the evening progressed, Sophia began noticing things that made her increasingly uneasy. The way Lorenzo's phone buzzed constantly throughout dinner, and how he would glance at it with expressions that grew progressively more tense. The formal manner in which the household staff addressed him, with a deference that seemed more like fear than respect. The way conversation stopped whenever one of the men in suits appeared to whisper something in Lorenzo's ear. Most unsettling was the transformation she witnessed in Lorenzo himself. The warm, attentive man who had walked with her in the garden gradually gave way to someone colder, more controlled, who spoke in clipped sentences and watched everything with the alertness of someone expecting trouble. After the main course, Lorenzo's phone rang with a tone that made everyone at the table go silent. He glanced at the caller ID and his face hardened into an expression Sophia had never seen before, all warmth disappearing behind a mask of cold authority that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. "I need to take this," he said, his voice carrying an edge that brooked no argument. "Excuse me for a moment." He stepped into the hallway, but Sophia could hear his voice through the partially open door, low and dangerous in a way that made her skin prickle with instinctive alarm. The words she caught were fragmented but disturbing, references to territory and messages and consequences that painted a picture she didn't want to believe. "This is the second time they've pushed into our neighborhood," Lorenzo was saying, his tone carrying the kind of cold fury that promised violence. "I want them to understand that there are consequences for disrespecting our boundaries. Make it clear that further incursions won't be tolerated." Sophia's blood ran cold as she processed what she was hearing. Territory, boundaries, consequences. These weren't the words of legitimate business, regardless of what Maria had said about import-export. These were the words of someone who controlled illegal activities, someone dangerous enough that people feared crossing him. When Lorenzo returned to the dining room 10 minutes later, his mask was back in place, but Sophia could see the tension radiating from him like heat. He apologized for the interruption with smooth professionalism, but the man who sat back down beside her felt like a stranger wearing Lorenzo's face. "Is everything all right?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the kind of maternal concern that suggested she was familiar with these kinds of interruptions. "Everything's handled," Lorenzo replied, but Sophia noticed that his hands were clenched into fists on the table, and the careful control in his voice suggested he was fighting to contain something violent. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and growing tension. Sophia found herself studying Lorenzo's face, looking for signs of the gentle man who had shown her his father's roses, but seeing instead someone who spoke about consequences and territory with the casual authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. As they prepared to leave, Maria pressed a handwritten recipe card into Sophia's hands with a warm smile. "My mother's tiramisu," she said. "Lorenzo's favorite dessert. Perhaps you'll make it for him someday." Sophia accepted the card with trembling fingers, touched by the gesture even as her mind reeled with questions about what kind of family she had just shared dinner with. The recipe felt like a bridge between two worlds, a piece of normal domestic life offered by a woman whose son apparently lived in a realm of threats and violence. The car ride home was filled with a tension so thick Sophia could barely breathe. Lorenzo drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to make his knuckles white. Sophia wanted to ask about the phone call, about the words she had overheard, but something in his expression warned her that questions might not be welcome. Finally, she found her courage. "Lorenzo," she said softly, "what kind of import business requires you to talk about territory and consequences?" Lorenzo's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment Sophia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Sometimes business involves complicated negotiations with difficult people," he said. "Not everyone respects proper channels or established agreements." It was a non-answer wrapped in diplomatic language, and they both knew it. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that Lorenzo was either lying to her directly or telling her a truth so carefully edited that it amounted to the same thing. The rest of the drive passed in silence that felt heavy with unspoken questions and carefully avoided truths. When Lorenzo pulled up in front of Sophia's building, she turned to thank him for dinner, but the words died in her throat when she saw his expression. He was looking at her with a mixture of longing and regret that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. For just a moment, his careful mask slipped, and she saw the internal war playing out behind his green-gray eyes. The battle between wanting her closer and knowing he should let her go. "Sophia," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been pain, "I need you to know that whatever you think you heard tonight, whatever questions you have, my feelings for you are genuine. You make me want to be someone better than I am." The confession hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn, a choice that would determine whether she stepped further into his world or retreated to the safety of ignorance. Looking into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, Sophia realized she was already falling for a man whose true nature remained a mystery wrapped in expensive suits and careful evasions. As she walked toward her building, Sophia felt the weight of Lorenzo's gaze following her, along with the certain knowledge that everything in her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The call came at 2 in the morning on Tuesday, piercing through Sophia's exhausted sleep like a blade through silk. Her father's co-worker from the warehouse spoke in rapid, panicked sentences that took precious seconds for Sophia's foggy brain to process. Thomas had collapsed during his shift. "Ambulance. St. Mary's Hospital. Heart attack. Come immediately." Sophia threw on the first clothes she could find and caught the first available cab, her hands shaking as she gave the driver directions while her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. She had known this day might come eventually, had seen the warning signs in her father's increasing fatigue and shortness of breath, but the knowledge did nothing to prepare her for the cold terror that gripped her chest as she rushed through empty streets toward the hospital. The emergency department was a chaos of fluorescent lights and urgent voices, the kind of controlled pandemonium that Sophia recognized from too many previous visits. She found her father in a curtained alcove, looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen him, connected to machines that beeped with mechanical urgency, while a young doctor explained terms like cardiac catheterization and emergency intervention. "We're taking him up for surgery immediately," the doctor said, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who delivered life and death news multiple times per day. "The blockage is significant, but we caught it in time. The next few hours will be critical." Sophia nodded numbly, signing consent forms and answering questions about insurance, while part of her mind calculated costs that she knew would be impossible to manage. Emergency surgery, cardiac intervention, hospital stay, rehabilitation. The numbers swirled in her head like a nightmare equation with no solution that didn't end in financial destruction. As they wheeled her father away, Sophia sank into a plastic waiting room chair, and tried to process the reality that had just crashed into her carefully managed existence. She called in sick to both jobs, knowing that missing work would only compound her financial stress, but unable to imagine being anywhere other than this hospital until she knew her father would survive. It was during the third hour of waiting, while she dozed fitfully in her chair, that Sophia became aware of voices nearby that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Delacroix owes us 18,000, plus interest," one voice was saying, rough and unforgiving in a way that spoke of violence as casual as breathing. "The old man can't work if he's dead, but his daughter, she's got those 2 jobs. She can pick up his payments." Sophia's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering as she realized they were talking about her family. She remained perfectly still, feigning sleep, while terror crept up her spine like ice water. "The girl's pretty," a second voice added with the kind of leer that made Sophia's skin crawl. "If she can't make payments, maybe we can work out alternative arrangements. Boss says we need to start collecting on the Delacroix debt one way or another." $18,000. The number hit Sophia like a physical blow, stunning her with its impossibility. Her father owed $18,000 to people who spoke about violence and alternative arrangements like they were discussing weather. Her mind raced as she tried to understand how this had happened, when her father's gambling had escalated to the point of borrowing from people who clearly weren't legitimate lenders. "We give her 1 week to come up with a payment plan," the first voice continued. "Make it clear that failure to cooperate will have consequences for both her and the old man. These neighborhood people need to understand that debts don't disappear just because someone has a medical emergency." Sophia forced herself to remain motionless as footsteps moved past her chair, though every instinct screamed at her to run. When she finally dared to open her eyes, she saw 2 men in expensive suits walking toward the elevator, their movements carrying the kind of predatory confidence that spoke of people accustomed to intimidating others. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and tried to calculate $18,000 against her monthly income. Even if she worked every available shift at both jobs, even if she eliminated every expense except the absolute necessities, it would take her over a year to accumulate that kind of money. And these men had given her 1 week. The next few hours passed in a blur of surgical updates and growing panic. Her father's operation was successful, the doctor explained, but recovery would be lengthy and he wouldn't be able to return to physical work for months. The relief Sophia felt at his survival was immediately tempered by the crushing realization that his lost income made their financial situation even more impossible. As she sat beside his bed in the cardiac recovery unit, watching his chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm that meant life, Sophia tried to formulate a plan that didn't end in disaster. She could try to negotiate with the loan sharks, explain that her father's medical emergency made immediate payment impossible. She could attempt to take out legitimate loans, though her credit score and income made approval unlikely. She could ask friends for help, though none of the people in her life had the kind of money that would make a difference. Every option she considered felt like grasping at smoke, insubstantial, and ultimately useless against the stark reality of $18,000 owed to people who didn't accept excuses or negotiate in good faith. She was still wrestling with impossible mathematics when a commotion in the hallway drew her attention. Voices were rising, the kind of sharp exchanges that suggested confrontation, and Sophia's stomach clenched as she recognized one of the voices from the waiting room. "Miss Delacroix," the rough voice called, and Sophia's blood turned to ice as she realized they had found her. "We need to have a conversation about your father's financial obligations." Sophia stood on unsteady legs and moved to the doorway, where she found the 2 men from earlier flanking a nurse who looked terrified and uncertain. The men were exactly what she had expected, expensive suits that couldn't hide the violence in their eyes, the kind of people who made threats feel like promises. "My father just had emergency surgery," Sophia said, trying to keep her voice steady while her heart hammered against her ribs. "This isn't an appropriate time or place for business discussions." The larger of the 2 men smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Actually, Miss Delacroix, this is exactly the right time. Medical emergencies are expensive, and expensive problems require immediate solutions. Your father owes our organization $18,000, plus interest that's been accumulating for 6 months. I don't know anything about my father's debts, Sophia lied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. You know now, the second man said, stepping closer in a way that made Sophia instinctively back toward her father's room. And knowing makes you responsible for finding solutions. We're reasonable people, Miss Delacroix. We understand that circumstances change, but debts don't disappear because of inconvenience. Sophia felt trapped between the hospital room, where her father lay unconscious, and the hallway where these men spoke about consequences with casual certainty. She opened her mouth to attempt negotiation, to buy time she didn't have with promises she couldn't keep, when a voice from behind the men made everyone freeze. Gentlemen, Lorenzo Torino said, his tone carrying a cold authority that seemed to lower the temperature in the hallway. I think you're in the wrong place. Sophia's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror as she saw Lorenzo walking toward them with the kind of measured pace that suggested complete control. He looked exactly as he had at dinner, impeccably dressed and devastatingly handsome. But there was something in his expression that made the loan sharks immediately step back from Sophia's doorway. Mr. Torino, the larger man said, and Sophia caught the deference in his voice, the way his posture shifted from threatening to almost respectful. We didn't know the girl was under your protection. She wasn't, Lorenzo replied, his green-gray eyes never leaving Sophia's face. Until now. The simple declaration hung in the air like a shield thrown between Sophia and the men who had been threatening her family. She stared at Lorenzo, trying to process his sudden appearance and the way the loan sharks were backing down from someone who, according to his mother, was in the import business. The debt, the smaller man began, but Lorenzo cut him off with a gesture that suggested the conversation was over. Will be handled through proper channels, Lorenzo said. Miss Delacroix is no longer your concern. Any questions about the Delacroix account can be directed to my office. The men exchanged glances that spoke of calculations Sophia couldn't interpret, then nodded curtly and walked away with the kind of swift departure that suggested they weren't interested in challenging Lorenzo's authority. Sophia watched them disappear around a corner, then turned back to find Lorenzo studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. How did you know I was here? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lorenzo moved closer, and Sophia caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something that might have been worry. I have people who keep me informed about things that matter to me, he said. When Thomas Delacroix was brought in for emergency surgery, I was notified. The casual way he mentioned having her family under surveillance should have been terrifying, but Sophia found herself feeling grateful instead. Without his intervention, she would still be facing threats she had no ability to counter, dealing with people who measured consequences in physical harm. You knew about my father's debt, Sophia said, and it wasn't a question. Lorenzo's jaw tightened slightly, and Sophia saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his features. I knew he owed money to the wrong people, he admitted. I've been working on resolving the situation quietly, but tonight's emergency accelerated the timeline. Sophia felt anger and gratitude warring in her chest, a combination of emotions that left her feeling dizzy and confused. You've been paying his debts without telling me, she said. I've been ensuring that your family isn't harmed by circumstances beyond your control, Lorenzo corrected. Your father's gambling addiction put him in contact with people who don't negotiate in good faith. I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer for his mistakes. The confession hung between them like a bridge Sophia wasn't sure she wanted to cross. Part of her was furious at his presumption, at the way he had inserted himself into her life without her knowledge or consent. But another part of her was overwhelmingly grateful that someone had been protecting her family from consequences she hadn't even known existed. Why? Sophia asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and need to understand his motivations. Lorenzo reached out and touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the cold authority he had used with the loan sharks. Because you matter to me, he said simply. Because watching you work yourself to exhaustion trying to solve problems that could be handled with a phone call makes something in my chest ache in a way I've never experienced before. Sophia felt tears she hadn't realized she was holding back spill over her cheeks. The stress of the night, her father's surgery, the threats from dangerous men, Lorenzo's unexpected protection, it all crashed over her like a wave that left her gasping and overwhelmed. I don't understand any of this, she whispered. I don't understand who you really are, or why those men were afraid of you, or how you have the power to make $18,000 disappear with a conversation. Lorenzo pulled her against his chest, and Sophia found herself clinging to his strength like a lifeline in a storm she couldn't navigate alone. She felt his hand stroking her hair, heard him murmuring reassurances in a voice so gentle it seemed to belong to a different person than the one who had faced down loan sharks with casual authority. My name is Lorenzo Torino, he said quietly. My family controls territory in this city that includes protection for people who can't protect themselves. What you saw tonight, what you heard at dinner, it's all part of a world that I inherited and that I've tried to keep separate from my feelings for you. Sophia pulled back to look at his face, seeing honesty mixed with fear in his expression. You're in the Mafia, she said, and the words felt surreal even as she spoke them. Lorenzo nodded, his green-gray eyes never leaving hers. I am. And now that those men know you're connected to me, you're part of this world whether you choose to be or not. They'll use you to get to me if they can. The only way to keep you safe is to keep you close. Lorenzo's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Manhattan that commanded views of Central Park and the Hudson River. Sophia stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows in what he called the living room, though it was larger than her entire apartment, watching the city spread out below her like a glittering circuit board of lights and movement. She had been there for 6 hours, ever since Lorenzo's men had collected her belongings from Queens while she waited at the hospital for her father to wake up from surgery. The transition from her modest life to this rarefied existence felt surreal, like stepping into a movie where she didn't know her lines or understand the plot. Your father is stable, Lorenzo said from behind her, his voice gentle in the way she was learning meant he was trying not to overwhelm her with too much change at once. The cardiologist says his recovery should be complete, though it will take time. Sophia turned to find him watching her with an expression that mixed concern with careful attention, as if he was cataloging her reactions to gauge whether she might bolt for the door. He had changed from his hospital clothes into dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his green-gray eyes look almost silver in the ambient lighting. How long do I need to stay here? Sophia asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be measured in days or weeks. Lorenzo moved closer, stopping just within arm's reach but not touching her, respecting the space she needed to process everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. Until the loan shark situation is resolved permanently, he said. Until I'm certain that no one connected to your father's debt sees you as a target or a tool to use against me. Sophia sank onto the leather sofa that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, feeling the weight of her new reality settling over her like a blanket that was both protective and suffocating. She thought about her jobs, her small apartment, her carefully maintained independence, all of it suddenly as distant as childhood memories. My whole life was built around taking care of myself, Sophia said, staring at her hands in her lap. I've been working since I was 16, paying my own bills, making my own decisions. I don't know how to be someone who needs protection. Lorenzo sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but careful not to crowd her. You're not someone who needs protection because you're weak, he said quietly. You're someone who deserves protection because you're precious. There's a difference. Sophia felt tears threaten again, though she had thought she was finished crying for the night. The gentleness in his voice, the way he spoke about her worth as if it were an established fact rather than something she had to prove through constant effort, made something in her chest ache with longing for acceptance she hadn't realized she craved. Tell me about your father's gambling, Lorenzo said, and Sophia heard the careful neutrality in his tone that suggested he was asking not to judge but to understand. Sophia was quiet for several minutes, organizing thoughts and memories she preferred to keep buried. My mother died when I was 16, she said finally. Cancer. The medical bills destroyed our savings, and Dad started gambling as a way to cope with grief and stress. He convinced himself he could win back what we'd lost, that one big score would solve all our problems. Lorenzo listened without interruption, his attention focused entirely on her words in a way that made Sophia feel heard in a manner she rarely experienced. She found herself sharing details she had never told anyone, the shame and fear and desperate love that had defined her relationship with her father's addiction. I've bailed him out before, Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Smaller amounts, a few thousand here and there when his debts got dangerous. But I made him promise each time that it would be the last time, that he would get help, that he understood how his choices affected both of us. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for years. Lorenzo felt his own chest tighten with anger at Thomas Delacroix for putting his daughter in impossible positions, and with protective fury at the loan sharks who had seen Sophia's love for her father as a vulnerability to exploit. You blame yourself, Lorenzo observed, and Sophia's quick glance confirmed his assessment. I should have known he was in deeper than he admitted, Sophia said. I should have seen the signs earlier, should have found a way to get him into a treatment program before it reached this point. If I hadn't been working so much, if I had paid closer attention. Lorenzo reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady against her cold skin. Your father's addiction isn't your responsibility, he said firmly. His debt isn't your fault. The only people to blame are the men who prey on desperation and the man who chose gambling over his daughter's security. Sophia looked up at him, seeing something fierce and protective in his expression that made her heart perform the familiar gymnastics that had become her body's automatic response to his presence. You sound like you understand addiction, she said. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand while he seemed to debate how much truth to share. My father wasn't an addict, he said finally, but he was consumed by responsibility in a way that destroyed him just as effectively. He carried the weight of protecting our family, our territory, our people, and he never learned how to set any of it down. Sophia heard the grief in his voice, the guilt that suggested Lorenzo blamed himself for his father's death in much the same way she blamed herself for her father's addiction. You think you're following the same path, she said. I know I am, Lorenzo replied with brutal honesty. The night my father died, I promised myself I would be stronger, that I wouldn't let the weight of leadership kill me the way it killed him. But every day, I feel the same pressure building, the same sense that everyone's safety depends on my ability to make the right decisions and eliminate threats before they destroy the people I'm responsible for protecting. Sophia turned to face him more fully, seeing the loneliness in his expression that he usually hid behind confidence and control. Who protects you? She asked softly. Lorenzo's smile was rueful and tinged with something that might have been surprise at the question. No one, he said. That's not how this works. I'm the shield, not the person who gets shielded. The simple statement broke something open in Sophia's chest, a understanding that Lorenzo's power came with isolation that was just as complete as her own had been, though for different reasons. They were both people who had learned to carry impossible weights alone, who had built their identities around being strong enough to handle whatever life demanded from them. You don't have to be alone anymore, Sophia said, the words emerging from some deep place of certainty that surprised her with its clarity. If you're asking me to let you protect me, then I'm asking you to let me be someone who cares about your well-being too. Lorenzo stared at her, and Sophia saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before he leaned forward and kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget to breathe. His lips were warm and firm, moving against hers with a reverence that spoke of feelings deeper than attraction or desire. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion that made Sophia's heart race. I love you, he said, the words carrying a weight that suggested he had never spoken them to anyone before. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you choose to help people even when you can barely help yourself. I love that you see protecting me as a gift you can give rather than a burden you'd have to carry. Sophia felt tears spill over her cheeks again, though this time they came from overwhelming relief rather than fear or stress. I love you too, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled slightly. I love you even though I'm terrified of your world and what it means for my future. I love you enough to trust you with everything I've spent my adult life protecting on my own. Lorenzo's response was to kiss her again, deeper this time, with a passion that spoke of need and relief and promises that neither of them had words to express. Sophia found herself responding with equal intensity, her hands tangling in his hair as 6 months of attraction and emotional connection finally found physical expression. When he lifted her in his arms and carried her toward his bedroom, Sophia felt no hesitation or uncertainty. This felt like the inevitable conclusion to every conversation they had shared, every moment of eye contact that had lasted longer than necessary, every instance where his gentleness had made her feel precious rather than fragile. Lorenzo set her down beside his bed and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing directly into her soul. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with desire held carefully in check. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to pretending this is casual or temporary." Sophia answered by reaching for the hem of her dress and pulling it over her head, standing before him in simple cotton underwear that felt suddenly elegant under the reverent way his gaze traveled over her body. She watched his breathing change, saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides, as if he was fighting to maintain control. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Sophia said, and realized it was absolutely true. What followed was tender and intense, careful and passionate, everything Sophia had imagined making love should be, but had never experienced with the few men in her past. Lorenzo touched her like she was precious, kissed her like she was essential to his survival, moved with her in a rhythm that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in sheets that felt like silk against Sophia's skin, her head on his chest, where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat gradually returning to normal. Lorenzo's fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder, and Sophia found herself marveling at how right this felt despite the circumstances that had brought them together. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made staying in bed feel like the only reasonable option. Sophia woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been bacon, luxuries that her usual breakfast budget didn't accommodate. She found Lorenzo in his kitchen, which was the kind of space that belonged in architectural magazines, all marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. He was standing at the stove wearing jeans and nothing else, his dark hair still mussed from sleep, looking domestically perfect in a way that made Sophia's heart skip. "Good morning," he said, turning to smile at her with an expression so warm and content that Sophia felt like she was seeing a version of him that existed only in private moments like this. Sophia had borrowed one of his shirts, which hung to mid-thigh and made her feel deliciously claimed in a way she had never experienced before. "Good morning," she replied, moving to stand beside him and marveling at how natural it felt to fit herself against his side while he cooked. They ate breakfast together at his dining table, sharing comfortable silence broken by easy conversation about everything except the dangerous world that surrounded his penthouse like an invisible barrier. For 45 minutes, Sophia allowed herself to imagine that this was her life, that domestic mornings with Lorenzo were her new reality rather than an interlude before she had to face the consequences of choosing him. The fantasy ended when Lorenzo's phone rang with the tone Sophia was learning to associate with business that couldn't be ignored. He answered with his usual careful control, but Sophia watched his expression change as he listened to whatever his caller was reporting. "Bring him to the warehouse," Lorenzo said finally, his voice carrying the cold authority that still made Sophia's skin prickle with awareness of his true nature. "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up and turned to Sophia with an expression that mixed regret with something that might have been anticipation. "The loan shark situation is ready for final resolution," he said. "The man who threatened you and your father has been located and contained." Sophia felt her stomach clench with a combination of relief and apprehension. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. "It means I'm going to have a conversation with him about respecting boundaries and understanding consequences," Lorenzo replied, his tone carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested the conversation would involve more than words. "It means ensuring that no one connected to your father's debt will ever threaten your family again." "I want to come with you," Sophia said, the words surprising her with their certainty. Lorenzo's expression immediately became protective and concerned. "Sophia, you don't need to see this. Let me handle it and come back to tell you it's finished." But Sophia was already shaking her head, understanding instinctively that witnessing Lorenzo's methods was essential to truly accepting who he was and what their life together would entail. "If I'm choosing your world," she said, "then I need to understand what that world looks like. I need to see who you become when you're eliminating threats, and I need to decide if I can love all of you, not just the gentle version you show me in private." Lorenzo studied her face for a long moment, and Sophia saw the internal debate playing out behind his green-gray eyes. Finally, he nodded with the kind of reluctant respect that suggested he understood her reasoning, even if he wished she would choose differently. 30 minutes later, Sophia found herself in the passenger seat of Lorenzo's car, driving toward a warehouse in Queens that looked abandoned from the outside, but clearly served purposes that weren't immediately apparent. Her stomach churned with nervousness, but she felt oddly calm about witnessing whatever was about to happen. The warehouse interior was exactly what Sophia expected from movies about organized crime, all concrete floors and industrial lighting, with several men in suits who nodded respectfully as Lorenzo entered. In the center of the space, tied to a metal chair, sat the larger of the two loan sharks who had threatened her at the hospital. Lorenzo's transformation was immediate and complete. The gentle man who had made her breakfast disappeared, replaced by someone whose presence commanded absolute attention and respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made threats unnecessary because his reputation preceded him. The conversation that followed was brief and decisive. Lorenzo explained, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that the Delacroix family was under his permanent protection, that any future contact with Sophia or her father would be considered a direct challenge to his authority, and that challenges to his authority had consequences that weren't negotiable. Sophia watched, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, as the loan shark's bravado crumbled under Lorenzo's quiet intensity. This was the man who controlled territory through reputation and decisive action, who eliminated problems before they could threaten the people he protected. This was the reality of loving someone whose power came from violence, even violence used in service of protection. When it was over, when the loan shark had been released with instructions to spread word about the new status of the Delacroix account, Lorenzo turned to Sophia with an expression that mixed vulnerability with resignation, as if he was prepared for her to be repulsed by what she had witnessed. Instead, Sophia moved closer to him, studying his face and seeing the man she loved underneath the cold authority he wore like armor. "You're not a monster," she said quietly. "You're someone who does what's necessary to protect the people who matter to you. I can live with that. I can love you knowing that." Lorenzo's relief was so profound that Sophia felt it like warmth spreading through her chest. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, rapid with emotion he was trying to contain. "Marry me," he said into her hair, the words muffled but unmistakably clear. "Not because you need protection or because circumstances force us together, but because I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Because you make me want to be better than I am while accepting who I actually am." Sophia pulled back to look at his face, seeing hope and fear warring in his expression. "Yes," she said, the word coming without hesitation or doubt. "Yes, because I love you enough to choose this world if it means I get to choose you too." 6 months later, the Torino estate glittered with lights strung through the garden where Lorenzo had first shared his father's roses with Sophia. The engagement party was everything Maria had insisted it should be, elegant and warm, and filled with people whose presence meant acceptance into a world Sophia was still learning to navigate with grace. Sophia stood on the terrace in a midnight blue dress that Lorenzo had chosen specifically because it brought out her eyes, watching guests move through the garden below while she marveled at how dramatically her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she had been working double shifts and counting every dollar. Tonight, she wore sapphire earrings that had belonged to Lorenzo's grandmother and felt genuinely beautiful for the first time in her adult life. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light as she lifted a glass of champagne that probably cost more than her old weekly grocery budget. It was a classic solitaire, elegant and understated in the way Lorenzo had somehow known she would prefer over anything flashy or ostentatious. Every time she glanced at her hand, Sophia felt a flutter of disbelief that this life belonged to her, that she had found her way from financial desperation to security beyond anything she had dared to imagine. "Your father looks happy," Lorenzo said, appearing beside her with the quiet grace she had learned to expect. He gestured toward the garden where Thomas Delacroix was deep in animated conversation with several of Lorenzo's business associates. His color healthy, and his laugh genuine in a way Sophia hadn't heard since before her mother's death. Sophia smiled, feeling tears threaten as she watched her father looking more vibrant than he had in years. The cardiac rehabilitation program Lorenzo had arranged had been comprehensive and expensive, but more importantly, it had included addiction counseling that finally addressed the root causes of Thomas's gambling. For the first time in a decade, Sophia's father looked like a man who believed he deserved good things in his life. "He loves the job you found for him," Sophia said, squeezing Lorenzo's hand gratefully. "Managing the community center gives him purpose and keeps him connected to people who benefit from his help rather than people who prey on his weaknesses." Lorenzo had been careful to ensure that Thomas's new position felt earned rather than charitable, creating a role that utilized his natural leadership abilities while keeping him far away from environments where gambling was possible. The community center served families in crisis, and Thomas's personal experience with financial desperation made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate similar challenges. As they watched, Maria appeared beside Thomas with the kind of maternal attention she had extended to include both Sophia and her father in the months since the engagement. Sophia's chest warmed as she observed the easy affection between them. The way Maria had embraced Thomas as family despite his mistakes and Lorenzo's world's usual suspicion of outsiders. "Your mother has been teaching me to make your father's favorite foods," Sophia said, leaning into Lorenzo's side and marveling at how natural it felt to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than her own survival. "I know," Lorenzo replied, his voice carrying affectionate amusement. "She's been reporting your progress with the enthusiasm of someone training her successor. Yesterday she told me your lasagna might actually be better than hers, which is the highest compliment possible in Italian family hierarchy." Sophia laughed, remembering the intense concentration required to meet Maria's exacting standards for proper pasta preparation and sauce consistency. The cooking lessons had become their bonding ritual, hours spent in Maria's kitchen learning recipes that had been passed down through generations while sharing stories about their respective paths to loving Lorenzo. It was during those conversations that Sophia had begun to understand the true depth of Maria's relief at her son's engagement. Lorenzo's mother had watched him carry the weight of family responsibility alone for almost a decade, had seen him grow more isolated and controlled with each passing year. Sophia's presence in his life had returned something essential to him, a capacity for joy and tenderness that Maria had feared was permanently buried under the requirements of leadership. "The foundation work has been incredible," Sophia continued, referring to the charitable organization Lorenzo had created for her to manage. "Being able to help families facing the same crises I lived through, but having real resources to offer solutions instead of just sympathy. It feels like everything I went through has purpose now." The Delacroix Family Foundation focused on medical debt relief and addiction support, causes that spoke directly to Sophia's personal experience while allowing her natural compassion to make a tangible difference. Lorenzo had funded it generously but insisted that Sophia shape its mission and methods, recognizing that her understanding of desperation made her uniquely qualified to identify families genuinely in need versus those attempting to exploit charitable resources. Lorenzo turned to face her fully, his green-gray eyes reflecting the garden lights, and something deeper that still made Sophia's heart race after 6 months of seeing it daily. "You've made me better," he said quietly. "Watching you use your gifts to help people reminds me that power should serve purpose beyond just maintaining itself." Sophia reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw while she marveled at the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world. "You've made me stronger," she replied. "Loving you taught me that accepting help doesn't make me weak, and that I can trust someone else to care about my well-being without losing who I am." They were interrupted by Gianna's appearance, Lorenzo's sister practically vibrating with excitement as she approached with a tablet and what appeared to be detailed wedding planning spreadsheets. Sophia had grown to love Gianna's enthusiastic energy and her complete lack of interest in the darker aspects of family business, preferring to focus on art history and wedding preparations with equal intensity. "Sophia, we need to make final decisions about the church flowers," Gianna announced, launching into detailed descriptions of arrangements that all sounded beautiful to Sophia's untrained ear. And the photographer wants to know if you prefer the formal portraits before or after the ceremony. And there's still the question of whether the reception should have dancing or just dinner music. Sophia listened with amused patience, understanding that for Gianna, planning the perfect wedding was both an expression of love for her brother and a creative project that allowed her to channel her artistic sensibilities into practical applications. The wedding itself had grown from Lorenzo and Sophia's preference for something simple into Maria's vision of a celebration worthy of welcoming Sophia officially into the family. "Whatever you and your mother think is best," Sophia said, knowing that her deference to Maria's preferences was both practical and emotionally significant. "This is your family's tradition, and I want to honor that." Gianna beamed and hurried away to report Sophia's cooperation to their mother, leaving Lorenzo and Sophia alone again on the terrace. The party continued around them, but Sophia found herself focused entirely on the man beside her, still sometimes amazed that this life belonged to her. "Do you ever regret it?" Lorenzo asked suddenly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that suggested the question had been weighing on him. "Do you ever miss the independence you had before you chose this world?" Sophia considered the question seriously, thinking about her small apartment and her exhausting work schedule and the constant anxiety about money that had shaped every decision she made for years. She thought about the fear that had lived in her chest like a permanent resident, the loneliness that had made every problem feel impossible because she faced everything alone. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she said honestly. "I miss being able to make decisions without considering security implications or family expectations. But I don't miss struggling alone. I don't miss being afraid of every financial emergency or medical crisis. And I definitely don't miss not having you in my life." Lorenzo pulled her closer, and Sophia felt the tension leave his shoulders as her words reassured him about choices that couldn't be undone. She understood his need for confirmation that she was happy, that her love for him was strong enough to sustain the complexities of the life they were building together. A commotion near the garden entrance drew their attention, and Sophia watched as several guests moved aside to accommodate an elderly woman who appeared to be struggling with heavy shopping bags. The scene was so familiar that Sophia felt time fold in on itself, memories of that rainy day 6 months ago superimposing over the current moment like a double-exposed photograph. Without conscious thought, Sophia moved toward the woman, her instincts for helping others overriding any consideration of protocol or appearance. She reached the stranger just as the woman's grip on her bags began to fail, catching them before they could spill their contents across the garden path. "Let me help you with those," Sophia said, automatically adjusting her hold to support the weight while the woman steadied herself. "Oh, thank you, dear," the elderly woman replied, her voice carrying gratitude that reminded Sophia so powerfully of Maria's reaction 6 months ago that she felt momentarily disoriented. "I'm afraid I overestimated my strength when I accepted my granddaughter's invitation to this lovely party." Sophia helped the woman to a nearby chair and ensured she was comfortable before stepping back, suddenly aware that the entire interaction had been observed by dozens of people, including Lorenzo, who was watching from the terrace with an expression of such profound love that Sophia felt her knees go slightly weak. "You have a beautiful heart, my dear," the elderly woman said, echoing Maria's words from that day outside the hotel in a way that made Sophia believe in destiny more than she ever had before. As Sophia rejoined Lorenzo on the terrace, she found him surrounded by Maria and Gianna, both women looking at her with expressions of such warmth and pride that Sophia felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "That," Maria said with satisfaction, "is exactly why I knew you were perfect for my son from the moment I met you. Your kindness isn't something you perform for people who matter, it's who you are for anyone who needs it." Gianna nodded enthusiastically, already mentally cataloging the story for future retelling. "That woman was Councilman Rodriguez's mother," she added. "She'll tell everyone about Sophia's graciousness, which means everyone will know that Lorenzo chose someone worthy of our family's respect." But Sophia barely heard their words, focused instead on Lorenzo's face and the way he was looking at her like she had just confirmed every good thing he had ever believed about her character. In that moment, she understood that her instinctive kindness wasn't something she needed to suppress or calculate in this new world, but rather the quality that had brought her here and would continue to define her place in it. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the family had retreated to various parts of the house, Sophia and Lorenzo found themselves alone in the garden where everything had begun. They walked among his father's roses, now illuminated by moonlight and the distant glow of the house, while Sophia marveled at how the space that had once intimidated her now felt like home. "I've been thinking about children," Lorenzo said suddenly, his voice carrying the kind of careful hope that suggested he wasn't sure how she would respond to the topic. Sophia felt her heart skip, then settle into a rhythm that felt like anticipation mixed with joy. "So have I," she admitted. "I think about what kind of mother I would be, what kind of father you would be, what it would mean to raise children in your world." Lorenzo stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face with the gentleness she had learned to associate with his most vulnerable moments. "They would be safe," he said with conviction. "They would be loved beyond measure. They would grow up understanding that strength serves others, not just itself." Sophia reached up to cover his hands with her own, feeling the solid reality of the engagement ring against her finger and the promise of a future that extended far beyond their individual happiness. "They would be kind," she added. "They would understand that treating people with dignity isn't negotiable, regardless of circumstances or social status." The vision of their future children playing in this garden, learning about roses from their father and kindness from their mother, felt so real that Sophia could almost see small figures running among the flower beds while she and Lorenzo watched from the terrace where they now stood planning their life together. "I love you," Lorenzo said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I love you for choosing me despite everything that came with that choice. I love you for making me want to build something beautiful instead of just protecting what already exists." Sophia rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, tasting champagne and promises on his lips while the scent of roses surrounded them like a blessing. "I love you for seeing my kindness as strength instead of weakness," she whispered against his mouth. "I love you for making me feel precious instead of fragile." As they stood together in the garden where Lorenzo's father had once planted beauty to balance the ugliness of his world, Sophia realized that her act of kindness 6 months ago hadn't just changed her own life. It had created ripples that touched everyone around them, healing wounds and creating connections that extended far beyond what any of them could have imagined. She thought about the question Lorenzo had asked her that evening about regret, and knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again, would help the same elegant woman with the same generous heart, would follow the same path that led from $20 in cab fare to sapphire earrings and promises of forever. Looking down at her engagement ring sparkling in the moonlight, Sophia smiled at the memory of counting every dollar and worrying about cab fare. That woman, and felt like someone she had known in a previous life, before she learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest transformations, before she discovered that love could be both protection and freedom, before she found her way home to a family who valued her heart above everything else she had to offer. The garden around them seemed to whisper with the voices of everyone who had found their way to love through unexpected circumstances, everyone who had discovered that kindness was never wasted, everyone who had learned that sometimes the most important destinations were reached by helping strangers along the way. Sophia D. Ella Croix was going to become Sophia Torino in 3 months, and as she stood in her future husband's arms surrounded by roses and moonlight and the promise of a life built on love strong enough to transform 2 broken people into something whole, she knew that every difficult day that had brought her to this moment had been worth the destination. Have you ever experienced a moment of kindness that completely changed the trajectory of your life? Sometimes we never know how far our simple gestures travel, or whose heart they might touch in ways that create beautiful new beginnings. Share in the comments about a time when unexpected kindness, given or received, opened doors you never knew existed.